Next, we would like to welcome Daniil MURZYKAEV on stage with his project called Theory of Inevitability of Democratic States. Daniil's work examines different political structures and especially the advantages of democracies. Let's see what he found out.
Good afternoon, fellow listeners, the jury, everyone who's listening to me right here, right now on this amazing day, and actually, to be precise, a democratic state, the state of Luxembourg. I will be presenting a project that's slightly different to many projects presented here today, possibly, because it's a proposition of an explanatory theory that explains many politology and sociology related global factors and emergencies. The theory, again, before I introduce it, I want all of us to, for a moment, be directly submerged into the modern political context at which I'm presenting my theory. Unfortunately, for the whole of Europe, potentially, there is a relatively large-scale war going on right now in the Eastern Europe between Ukraine and Russia that invades it. And you might wonder why I'm introducing it before presenting my theory. Simply because that war, later on, would provide a very good illustration to my theory itself. How? You will know it by the end of the presentation when my theory would be presented. And the theory, as we all know, is the theory of inevitability, attention to democratic states. So how exactly was my theory constructed? How did I construct it? And how did I come to the conclusion that democratic states are inevitable in history? To understand that, everyone has to comprehend my model. The model is that in every society, in every state, even in the most democratic states possible, like Luxembourg, or Norway, or Sweden, there are constantly pro-democratic, obviously, and pro-authoritarian ideas. They're constantly there. They're never eliminated. Sometimes they're supported, actually often, by certain political parties. That makes these sort of ideologies a lot more visible. And in my theory, in my model, these two ideologies are in a constant struggle between each other. And each one of them prevails as a result of failure of the other, as it happened in many countries of Western Europe. As you can see on the picture, there's a certain cycle here. To explain the way it works, we have to look at the way institutions, political institutions, I'm not talking about economic institutions yet, have evolved throughout history. For example, in Europe, Western Europe, democratization was relatively successful. But that democratization, it does not constantly port more and more democracies in every single case, because we've seen downfalls and rises of democracies throughout history. For example, the city-state of Athens or the Roman Republic, later replaced by the feudal systems all around Europe. So we can agree that democratization is a cyclic process. It repeats itself and it rotates. But that's not what my theory states. My theory states that democratic states, funny enough, the way I said it, are inevitable. So how can we derive that conclusion from the cycles we have? And to, well, first of all, to illustrate the way I would present it, is that all of these cycles, and I do not deny them, I have never denied them, they're too obvious to deny, existent, they do, however, form a slightly, barely visible sense towards democratization. One may ask, how and what way? And that's exactly what I'm going to explain. But to understand that, we firstly need to understand the advantages democratic states have over relative autocracies, less democratic states. Firstly, efficiency for economic development. Of course, the subject is a constant subject for debates, quite still, but I'd say that democracies do have many advantages in terms of development in comparison to autocracies, relative autocracies. Because democracies concentrate political power on wide spectrums of the population, one way or the other, than simply a narrow group, they allow more rational decisions, and proven, taken, at least in theory, by the government. And that actually provides high advantages in development. Of course, this is often not very clear because states can, of course, undeniably develop under authoritarian regimes too. It's undeniable. But at the same time, well, first of all, economic development isn't simply growth, the way we want to look at it, because states can economically, the economy can grow under authoritarianism too. But talking about development, for even in the modern statistics, there are certain factors at which very democratic states such as the European Union in general and the United States prevail. Many less democratic systems, such as the same country of Russia, and it's their adaptability to new changes and, for example, green politics. We can agree that there is a large gap between how much the European Union have done to green politics in comparison to countries like China or Russia. That is a clear gap in development at the same time and improves my theory to some extent. Then there is also another factor to prove the sense of the cycles. There is an enormous structural variety of democracies in the world. As I've mentioned, every state, even the most authoritarian one, have some democratic features. For example, a parliament. Many modern systems have parliaments, but the system itself may not necessarily work fully as a democracy, may not be totally liberal. So many states claim to be a democracy, as illustrated on this map. And in comparison to the next map, on the relatively small proportion of the states are actually recognized as electoral democracies by the Freedom House. By analyzing democratic structures, there is an enormous variety of them. Every democratic structure in each state differs from another one way or the other. But in contrast, authoritarian structures tend to identically concentrate sovereign power on, very often, a narrow group. And that is a very clear sign of how innovative the idea of democracy actually is. Because democracy is nothing else but a political innovation for stable economic growth. At the same time, we can look at another advantageous features democracies can obtain, which actually strengthens them against authoritarianism. This includes federalism, forming federations, and bicameralism, similar structures. It's also created an enormous variety of them. None of them are exactly identical to the other. And that, again, proves the enormous innovative effect of democracy. Speaking of innovations, democracy itself, because it allows people from a wider spectrum of the population to participate in decision-making, at the same time is an innovation generator. Political innovations too. That's how we get such an enormous variety of democracies. Whereas in less democratic systems, relative autocracies, the only true political innovation that can emerge is the one to destroy and potentially democratize the system. On my slide, I've compared authoritarianist systems with sort of monopolies, because we can compare authoritarian systems with monopolies in the market and monopolistic market. Because we can all agree that in a monopolistic market, unless the monopoly is contestable, there are almost no innovations present because there is simply no need. In contrast, democratic systems, in terms of innovation, can easily be compared to a well-functional, organized, healthy, competitive market. That's my economical comparison. At the same time, there are another two pieces of evidence I would like to introduce that would underline the existence of a democratic sense. First, one of them being statistics. These are statistics created by the Freedom House. They truly show us the evolution towards democracies and cycles of democracy in the last 200 years. Before I finish presenting the sources, it was truly Freedom House, and the graph was obtained from Polity Data Series number 4. Before I conclude, there's another very strong point, very strong argument I would like to present, is that development itself, because states economically develop, is never static. It goes into recessions and growths. And since democracy, as it's obvious, is evoked at a particular stage of development and allows development to be longer lasting, therefore the only way democratization would never have been possible is a situation when there would not be any development, and that is impossible, and it clearly proves pro-democratic sense. Before I conclude, coming back to my first introduction at the beginning, a war between Russia and Ukraine, that war created by Russia is simply nothing more but a resistance towards democratization and repetition of the cycle. Its turn towards democratization, which would eventually happen. Finally, I say, may democracy prevail. Thank you very much.
Daniil, thank you for being here with us. How did it come about that you did this project?
Well, certainly it's very clear that contemporary events, certain events that are happening right now, political events and events that were happening when I started doing this project, because they're always there, there's always something happening. That was probably my biggest inspiration on analysis of the events around me. That's probably be my answer. Also, I want to say that I'm very interested in those kind of topics in general since several years ago, actually. Initially, I wanted my presentation to be a bit more economics related, but it turns out sort of more sociology related than I planned. And that's why
you did more research and so on, and you found that there was a lot of information that would feed into the topic. The focus of your project was more on the German political system to start off with. How did that change?
Well, simply, I've used Germany to be more precise, at the time when Germany was still divided by the Eastern and Western Germany, GDR and FRG. FRG is still existent, luckily. I personally used it. The only reason I've used it is because I found it to be one of the most perfect examples of illustration to my theory, because that I've chosen those two states simply for comparison of performance of different kinds of states and different kinds of systems. And the thing is, very often it's very hard to actually compare them because the circumstances are different. That's a bunch of research experience coming from me. And I found the German example the most suitable examples for me and the most comfortable. But as you may have noticed, I've changed my illustration example, I've changed my state. The only reason I did that is because my new example is a lot fresher than the example of Germany. And at the time when I actually when I was writing the project paper, that was before my new example has appeared. So the example of Germany was pretty much the best example I could find from an illustration. But because of the political circumstances, not that I support any sort of violence, I just use them as an illustration, that would actually give more comprehensible volume that you can feel immediately to my presentation. That's what I thought, and that's how I replaced my examples.
Could you maybe give us some more example of other countries that would fit for the model?
For the model, for example, on North and South Korea, so a contemporary example, I could also use this. The thing is, the example with the Ukrainian war is something that has appeared very, very recently. It's very fresh. As I've already said, I wanted to add volume to my presentation to place it into this contemporary word. But the example with Korea could also well work. At the same time, it would also be a bit more difficult, not just with Korea examples, but with the same comparison in general, because unfortunately, it's very often states that I want to emphasize, in contrast to democratic states, that there's often a lack of reliable data about them. For example, the same North Korea. I mean, people do launch investigations about those countries. At the same time, data is quite limited. Even about countries like that same country of Russia, statistics are still deformed. And again, that was also the reason for the example I chose at first, because there were actually some pretty reliable data available about the states I was contrasting, about the East Germany. I found quite a lot about it. And the contemporary examples, since it's happening, example actually that the example with the war happening in Ukraine right now, it's happening right now, and actually lots of data about it are quite available and clear. Again, another reason for why I chosen it.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time here, and all the best for what comes next, especially on Sunday, where you're presenting a poster. Is that right?
Yeah, I will be presenting, obviously. I mean, I've signed up for this.
Then very welcome. Yeah. Thank you for everything, and see you soon.
I would like